Something is breaking open right now that the mainstream news cycle cannot fully contain, and if you have been paying attention, really paying attention, you already know that the world you woke up to this morning is not the same world it was 3 weeks ago. What we are watching unfold in the Middle East is not just a military campaign. It is not just airstrikes and press conferences and talking heads debating red lines. What we are watching is the unraveling of a very specific assumption, the assumption that American military and economic supremacy can be projected anywhere on Earth with minimal cost, minimal blowback, and minimal consequence to the American people themselves. That assumption is being tested in real time, and the results so far are deeply uncomfortable for anyone who still believes the official story. At least 16 U.S. military aircraft have been lost since the start of the war with Iran, including 10 Reaper strike drones hit by enemy fire and a half dozen other planes badly damaged in attacks or accidents. Let that number sit with you for a moment. 16 aircraft. The number of aircraft losses is much higher than those recorded during the last large-scale air campaign that the U.S. was involved with, the military intervention in Libya in 2011, where only 3 combat losses were reported over 4 months. And what's being called the most powerful air force on the planet, equipped with the most expensive weapon systems ever built, is taking these losses against a country that has been under crippling economic sanctions for decades, flying Cold War era jets and operating on a fraction of the Pentagon's budget. That is not a small detail. That is the entire story. Let's go back to where this actually began, because the timeline matters enormously here, and most people in America are only catching up now. Beginning in late January 2026, the United States carried out its largest military buildup in the Middle East since the 2003 invasion of Iraq, deploying air, naval, and missile defense assets amid escalating tensions with Iran, which the United States attributed to Iran's nuclear program, the 2025-2026 Iranian protests, and a government crackdown that killed thousands of demonstrators. On 28 February 2026, this culminated in a series of joint military strikes in Iran by the United States and Israel, sparking the 2026 Iran war. So understand this. This war did not happen overnight. This was a constructed escalation, a carefully assembled justification over months, a buildup of assets, positioning, and political framing that led to a moment that many people inside the Washington establishment had been planning for a long time. The surprise U.S.-Israeli attack, launched during the nuclear negotiations, killed Khamenei, other Iranian officials, and civilians. Subsequent attacks damaged military bases, government facilities, schools, hospitals, and cultural heritage sites. In retaliation, Iran launched hundreds of drones and ballistic missiles at targets in Israel and at U.S. military bases in Bahrain, Jordan, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia. Read that again carefully. The attack was launched during nuclear negotiations, not after they failed. During them, just days after Oman's Foreign Minister Badr al-Busaidi said a breakthrough had been reached, and Iran had agreed both to never stockpile enriched uranium and to full verification. That is not a war of necessity. That is a war of choice, and someone in that decision-making chain made a very deliberate calculation that diplomacy needed to be buried before it could actually succeed. Now, the official justifications coming out of Washington have been shifting and multiplying in a way that should raise serious alarm bells for any thinking American. Trump administration officials have offered various and conflicting explanations for starting the war, such as to ward off an imminent Iranian threat, to preempt Iranian retaliation against U.S. assets after an expected Israeli attack on Iran, to destroy Iran's missile and military capabilities, to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon, to secure Iran's natural resources, and to achieve regime change by bringing the Iranian opposition to power. When you have that many explanations for a single decision, what you actually have is an absence of a coherent reason. Multiple narratives are deployed because no single one is sufficient to justify what was done. And that pattern of shifting, overlapping, contradictory justifications is one of the oldest telltale signs in the history of political deception. President Trump initiated a war against Iran without congressional approval, without a serious public debate, and in the face of overwhelming public opposition. This is a premeditated preventive war, not a defensive action to address an imminent threat to the United States. And yet, somehow, this has not become the defining scandal of the moment in American political discourse. Somehow, the constitutional question, the most basic question of who has the authority to send American men and women into combat, has been swept aside by the sheer speed and spectacle of the military operation itself. The Constitution's Article 2 authority pertaining to the executive branch has long been understood to allow the president to repel sudden attacks. It was never intended to allow a single person to launch the entire country into a war. That is the law. That is the foundational principle. And it is being openly, brazenly set aside. Now let's talk about the aircraft, because this is where the story gets deeply revealing about the real military balance of power. An Air Force F-35A fighter was forced to conduct an emergency landing at a U.S. air base after being struck by ground fire during a combat mission over Iran on March 19th. The IRGC said that it severely damaged the F-35 in its strike. The F-35, the crown jewel of American air power, the aircraft that the United States spent over $1 trillion developing and producing. The stealth fighter that was supposed to be essentially invisible to adversary radar systems hit, damaged, forced to land. And this is enormously significant, not just as a military fact, but as a strategic signal to every country on Earth that is currently watching this conflict and drawing their own conclusions. The first known combat damage to an F-35 fifth-generation fighter aircraft from a likely Iranian attack suggests that stealth jets can be detected by electro-optical and infrared sensor systems, according to Chinese analysts. Think about what that means for the broader global strategic picture. The F-35 is deployed across Asia. Japan has them, South Korea has them, Singapore has them, and they all figure prominently in American strategic planning regarding Taiwan and the broader Indo-Pacific. If Iran, under sanctions with a degraded military, can track and hit an F-35, then the calculus around every future conflict involving that aircraft has just fundamentally changed. China and Russia are watching this with extraordinary interest. For China and Russia, the F-35 tracking data held by the IRGC is worth its weight in gold. The broader aircraft losses tell an equally important story. 3 U.S. Air Force F-15E Strike Eagles were shot down over Kuwait by friendly fire from Kuwaiti air defenses on March 2nd. The 6 crew members ejected safely into Kuwait. That is the kind of incident that gets quietly buried in the back pages, but it tells you something critical about the chaos and friction of a real war, as opposed to the sanitized triumphalist version being sold to the American public. And then there was the tanker. 6 U.S. airmen were killed on March 12th when their KC-135 refueling aircraft crashed in western Iraq during combat operations. 6 American lives, real people with families. And this happened not from an enemy missile, but from the grinding, unforgiving operational tempo of a high-intensity air campaign. The U.S. has lost 16 aircraft, including 12 Reaper strike drones. Each of these drones could cost up to $56.5 million. This means that the U.S. has already lost Reaper drones worth over $500 million, $500 million in drones alone. And this is a war that is barely 3 weeks old. Now look at the other side of the damage ledger. According to IRGC claims, it has hit 4 AN/TPY-2 radars of THAAD batteries. There are only 10 THAAD systems globally. The U.S. operates 7 of these. THAAD, Terminal High Altitude Area Defense, is one of America's premier missile defense systems. Each radar is valued at somewhere between $300 million and $500 million, and Iran, the country with the Cold War-era Air Force and the decades of sanctions, has reportedly knocked out a significant portion of the global THAAD inventory. If those claims hold up, that is not just a military setback, that is an embarrassment of the first order for the American defense establishment. And it raises profound questions about the gap between what the Pentagon's most advanced and expensive systems can actually do versus what they are advertised to do. Now let's talk about the Strait of Hormuz, because this is where the war has left the battlefield and entered your kitchen, your gas station, and your grocery bill. Amid fears of prolonged supply shortages, Oil prices surged faster than during any other conflict in recent history. Brent crude oil prices surpassed $100 per barrel on 8th of March 2026 for the first time in 4 years, rising to $120 per barrel at its peak. The closure of the strait has been described as the largest disruption to the energy supply since the 1970s energy crisis, as well as the largest in the history of the global oil market. The largest in history, not the largest in recent memory, the largest ever recorded. And when Trump was asked about gas prices rising for ordinary Americans, he reportedly said, and I want you to think about this, if they rise, they rise. The near total halt of traffic through the Strait of Hormuz, the key waterway through which about a fifth of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas typically passes, has created a catastrophic disruption in oil markets. While the world had been oversupplied with oil in February, the amount of oil stored at sea is quickly falling, and oil prices have risen around 45% since the war began. Crude oil prices have now topped $110 per barrel and could climb more. Those higher prices have rippled through to U.S. gasoline prices, a 45% increase in oil prices in less than a month. And this is happening on top of an already fragile American economy dealing with tariff-driven inflation, supply chain disruptions, and the lingering pressures of a Federal Reserve that has been trying to thread the needle between growth and price stability. Former Federal Reserve Chair Janet Yellen has warned that depending on the impact of the war on the oil market, economic growth will suffer, and the Fed's job of containing inflation will become more difficult. The IEA called this the greatest global energy security challenge in history. Not a challenge, the greatest challenge. And the emergency response, releasing strategic petroleum reserves, is, by all honest analysis, a Band-Aid on a wound that requires surgery. The U.S. Department of Energy said the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve held 415.4 million barrels as of 18th February 2026. At that rate, 400 million barrels would theoretically cover just 4 days of global consumption. 4 days. That is the margin. 4 days of global consumption is what the world's entire combined emergency reserve release amounts to in the context of a fully closed Strait of Hormuz. That is not a solution. That is a holding pattern, while the diplomats scramble and the generals argue. And now we come to the question of allies, because this is where America's position in the world is being revealed most starkly. After bruising tariff battles with Trump last year, the first months of 2026 have further strained alliances. Trump's renewed pressure for U.S. control of Greenland, including a tariff threat against 8 European nations, and his false assertion that Allied troops avoided frontline fighting in the Afghanistan war, upset partners in the NATO military alliance. And now Trump wants those same allies, the ones he has been alienating, threatening, and publicly humiliating, to come and help police the Strait of Hormuz. Retired naval officers say that unblocking the Strait of Hormuz with military escorts while the war rages and without Iran's consent would be dangerous. The Europeans are not rushing to join. The Gulf states, fearful of Iranian retaliation, have been deeply reluctant throughout this entire campaign. Trump also addressed the strait. He said the Hormuz Strait will have to be guarded and policed as necessary by other nations who use it. The United States does not. He said, if asked, the U.S. would help these countries in their Hormuz efforts, but shouldn't be necessary once Iran's threat is eradicated. Now, that is a remarkable statement. The United States launches a war that closes the world's most important energy choke point and then tells the rest of the world to go figure out how to reopen it. The same allies who were told they are freeloaders, who were told their troops didn't fight, who were threatened with tariffs, those allies are now being asked to take on the military risk of forcing open a strait that was closed because of American and Israeli military action. What we are witnessing here is the collision between two fundamentally different realities. There is the reality being presented to the American public, a triumphalist narrative of military superiority, of objectives being met, of Iran being degraded and defanged. And then there is the messier, more complicated reality that emerges when you actually look at the numbers. No matter how precise or devastating, airstrikes alone cannot topple a government, and Iran in 2026 is likely to emerge battered but not broken. A costly example of American hubris and the limits of air power. That assessment comes not from Iran's propaganda machine, but from American strategic analysts at respected institutions. Battered, but not broken. Think about what that means for the day after. Think about what that means for the decade after. The Trump administration's explicit rejection of diplomacy in favor of force has the ultimate effect of incentivizing proliferation and making adversaries hesitant to participate in diplomacy with the United States. Prior to the June 2025 U.S. strikes against Iran, the Trump administration had engaged in talks with Iran about limits on the country's nuclear program. Those attacks on Iranian nuclear facilities were justified by the Trump administration as setting the program back and improving the U.S. negotiating position for new talks. And then those new talks were ongoing, with a reported breakthrough just days before the February 28th strikes, and the war was launched anyway. What message does that send to North Korea? To any country in the world that is considering whether negotiations with the United States are worth the risk. What it tells them is that signing agreements, making concessions, showing up at the table, none of that protects you from a decision made in Washington when the political winds shift. Trump said the operation would target Iran's missile capabilities, naval forces, and what he called its terrorist proxies, vowing to destroy their missiles and raze their missile industry to the ground and to annihilate their navy. He said the United States would ensure that Iran never obtains a nuclear weapon. Trump acknowledged that U.S. casualties were possible, saying American service members could be at risk as the operation unfolds. And yet, even as Trump speaks about meeting objectives and winding down, the IAEA's Director General made something very clear that cuts against the official victory narrative. The IAEA's Director General told NPR he believes parts of Iran's nuclear program will remain even after the heavy damage done by U.S. and Israeli military strikes. Of course, there is an enormous degradation of the physical facilities, Grossi told NPR. But most probably, at the end of this military conflict, the material will still be there and the enrichment capacities will be there. Perhaps some infrastructure will still be there. The material will still be there. The enrichment capacities will still be there. The stated objective of the war, preventing Iran from ever getting close to nuclear capability, has not been achieved, and according to the head of the world's nuclear watchdog, cannot be achieved by bombs alone. So what exactly was this war for, and who bears the costs? The American service members who lost their lives, 13 killed as of the latest count, roughly 200 wounded. The 6 airmen aboard that KC-135 tanker who did not come home. The American consumer now paying sharply higher prices at the pump and in the grocery store. The global economy absorbing the largest energy supply disruption in recorded history. The international credibility of the United States, which has now demonstrated to the world that it will launch a major war during active negotiations without congressional approval against the advice of its own intelligence officials because a senior counterterrorism official named Joe Kent resigned specifically saying Iran posed no imminent threat as this war began. What you are seeing right now is not just a military conflict. You are watching a fundamental restructuring of how power operates in the world, of who can credibly threaten whom, of what military technology can and cannot do, and of what the real price of American foreign policy decisions ultimately is, paid not by those who make the decisions, but by ordinary people here at home and across the globe. The history books will have a great deal to say about these weeks. The question that matters for you right now is whether you are watching closely enough to understand what is actually happening while it is happening.